be back with you right here on the India Development Debate on ET Now. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and straight on to the big topic that we're putting the spotlight on. The Modi government is leaving no stone unturned to woo the upper castes before general elections after the cabinet approved a 10% reservation for the economically weaker sections in the general category yesterday. Government today tabled the bill in Lok Sabha. Rajya Sabha has been extended up until tomorrow in all probability, in the hope of the quota bill sailing through in both houses. Defending the bill in the lower house, Finance Minister Jaitley said the move will not disturb the existing quotas and Parliament can increase the cap of 50% on total reservations. Even as the opposition questions the timing of the move, it remains to be seen which parties will have the wherewithal to vote against the bill. The impact of the historic quota bill based on economic class is the topic of discussion that we're putting the spotlight on in the India Development Debate this evening. There are also some worrying signs that are coming out where the private higher education institute has been put under this, and how worrying should all of that be. And what does this really mean? Are we one step away from private enterprise now being asked to put affirmative action? Many questions, and we'll try and get some of those answers right here. I've got an eminent panel joining me. Wajahat Habibullah, former chairperson of the National Commission for Minorities, and of course former CIC as well. Sanjay Srivastav, professor of sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth. Gurucharan Das, author and commentator, former CEO PNG India. And Sadanand Dhume, resident fellow American Enterprise Institute. So thank you very much, each one of you, for joining us. And Mr. Habibullah, if I may start with you. I'll get into the specifics in just a bit, but I first wanted to talk about the big picture. Is reservation, which was essentially looked at as a tool for social empowerment, for ending social discrimination, now being looked to combat poverty? Is that what reservation is now being put to use?
Well, you see, the reservation, when it started, when it was initiated and it was brought into the Constitution, was to rectify centuries of injustice done to certain classes of our society, the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, namely. There has been obviously a development since that time. There has been upward mobility among the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The discrimination in certain cases has not improved. In certain cases, some people have been able to take advantage of this, and so on. But the major challenge now is not so much this discrimination. Of course, that is a challenge, but nowadays the problem is one of poverty. And what the government has sought to do now is to address the question of poverty and bring the reservation for those who are hamstrung by poverty in not being able to pursue a better life for themselves and their families and the certain class of people to which they belong. So it is seeking to move beyond caste and the discrimination that was practiced as part of caste differences into an area where differences have emerged in our society on account of economic classification. This is therefore necessary, in concept, a positive step.
You believe in concept it is a positive step. Let me take this across to someone who may not agree with you. Well, Sadanand Dhume, Wajahat Habibullah believes in concept this could be a positive step because you're looking at the economic criteria. My question is that can reservation bear the burden of being an anti-poverty measure?
Well, I see it quite differently from Mr. Habibullah. I see, essentially I look back on 70 years and I see this as identity politics and essentially group identity run amok. Reservation was not only supposed to have been for very specific groups, mostly the scheduled castes, but also the scheduled tribes, but it was also supposed to have been a limited measure for 10 years. And there was a reason behind that. And the reason behind that was that this newly independent country was seeking to forge the idea of citizenship, the idea of Indianness that transcended these kind of narrow identities into which people are born. Effectively, 70 years later, you have politicians across all political parties accepting defeat, that there's no such thing as being simply an Indian. And now, basically, whether you're a medical student or whether you're a civil services aspirant, 6 out of 10 positions are going to be based on some combination of caste or some ascribed identity. You look around the world, and this is my last point. You don't see any successful society that has really developed by piling on more and more and more and more quotas to an already creaky system.
Oh, yes, absolutely, there is. And you know, Mr. Srivastav, I'll come to you, Professor Srivastav. I kind of agree with Sadhana, but is there this candid admission, finally, that the state has failed to create employment opportunities, has failed to create jobs, and has failed also on the education front to create people who are employable, people who could be absorbed by industries, people who could have been part of the growth story, and which is why we are resorting to things like reservation, and now, of course, on the economic criteria.
Look, I think I don't have a, I partly agree with Mr. Habibullah and Mr. Dume. I mean, the upper castes have always had identity politics. I don't have a problem with identity politics per se. The problem is that you cannot use reservations for poverty alleviation, because there are fundamental problems that our economies and the society is beset with, which have to do with, for example, the fact that employment in general has not increased as was promised, the fact that there is a great deal of rural distress, how do you address that? And the fact that government jobs themselves are not increasing. So if you do have a reservation of 10% for the so-called forward caste, where will they actually find jobs? So if you really want to address fundamental aspects of what is to happen in the future, then this form of reservation is certainly not the answer. And anyway, as we know, this is not something that's going to be immediately applicable, even if it passes through the Rajya Sabha, the Lok Sabha. We know that it has to go through the state legislatures as well. So I'm not really sure how serious a measure it is in the government's mind itself. But the fundamental problem really remains is that you need to take difficult decisions to address what are fundamentally issues of poverty. And this is not going to be done by 10% quota for the upper caste, because as Mr. Habibullah I think was saying, that the quota system, reservation system, was to address something that is quite specifically subcontinental, which is social deprivation and education deprivation. So we need to really try and work out whether any political party is willing to take the difficult decisions that are needed, rather than come up with this really Disneyland solutions of 10% reservations for the upper caste. That's what I would say.
No, absolutely. And I think, all three of you, in whatever points you're making, you're completely right, because politicians across the political spectrum, they may question the timing, they may call it a jumla, but are willing to support this wholeheartedly. I'll take a quick question, one more on jobs, and then move on to the implementation of this. And of course, the big scare of the private sector being pulled in as well. And Gurucharan Das, the whole debate really boils down to jobs. Are there enough jobs for this to be a meaningful move, apart from the fact that state legislatures will have to pass this. This is a constitution amendment. This is not going to happen automatically on its own. And is private sector being looked to chip in?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the disappointment that we have, and that's why Mr. Modi is partly in trouble. I mean, a year ago or 2 years ago, we thought that he would be easily re-elected. And now it's not certain, because we have not focused on jobs. And frankly, we need to be an economy that's growing above 8%. And the latest figures show that we have this last 2019, the growth rate from CSO is going to be 7.2. Now, that's not good enough. That's not what he promised. The country has been above 8% before, and there are difficulties of all kinds. And some of these have been self-inflicted, like demonetization. I think GST is a very good idea. The insolvency bill is a very good idea. There are many, as I said, the health are good things we have done. And there'll be even long-term benefits that will come from demonetization. But the truth of the matter is that if I were Mr. Modi, I would have focused single-mindedly on the promise of Vikas and Achhe Din from day number one.
No, I do want to take this debate forward, and I will take a quick question to Wajahat Habibullah. And sir, if I may quote from the bill that has been tabled, it says it provides for reservation for the economically weaker sections of society in higher educational institutions, including private institutions, whether aided or unaided by the state, other than, of course, the minority educational institutions referred to in Article 30. Is this new? Is this because this is, at least on social media, this has spread a lot of scare that perhaps the private sector, at least the educational institutions up until now, the higher educational institutions are being made to follow what was happening to schools, the right to education, and how 25% of quota was done for EWS.
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
The bill talks about reservation for the economically weaker sections of society in higher educational institutions, including private institutions, whether aided or unaided. Is this reservation in higher private education? Is that how one should see this?
Well, that is what it says. How it is going to work in practice will remain to be seen. In fact, regarding the entire bill, it remains to be seen how it will work in practice. I did mention that the concept is correct and it is salutary. We'll need to see how it is going to be made to work and the question that you have raised is one of those questions. Will the private institutions also implement this, the private institutions of higher education? And if that is the case, how is the government going to ensure enforcement in those private institutions?
Gurucharan Das, let me take this quick question to you, and I will quote from what the bill says. It talks about reservations in private educational institutions, whether aided or unaided. Does this bring private sector under the ambit of reservation? Because that is the big scare. Is the next step going to be to breach the private sector and its autonomy?
Well, I hope not. I don't know. I haven't read the bill as it is proposed, but I would say that today we already have, for the private sector, meaning private sector schools, private schools, you have a reservation. And that's a much better form of reservation. And the idea that you put the private sector companies to insist on that, I think that is totally wrong. That will make our nation uncompetitive. You better forget about Make in India. You better forget about exports. You will, if you can't get the best people today, every company complains that they cannot get good people. And if you already have a talent scarcity, you're just going through the policy of, through a policy that offends meritocracy, you're going to make it much worse.
Okay, I'll take this across to Sadanand Dhume. And Sadanand, while it doesn't explicitly talk about reservations in the private sector, just to be the devil's advocate for a minute, and I know these are ideas that are toyed with every government, should there be affirmative action on the private sector's part and all of that. If you look at employment data across the private enterprise in India, on the social inclusion front, it's very lacking. Do you believe there needs to be incentive for the private sector? Do you believe there needs to be some affirmative action that private enterprise needs to show on this front? Or do you believe private enterprise is autonomous, should be left to take its own decision, which may or may not include social inclusion?
I may be the wrong person to ask this question. I mean, I'm against quotas, period. I'm against outcome-based affirmative action of all types. I believe in equality of opportunity. I would like to see many, many more people of all castes and all backgrounds employed, both in the government and in the private sector. I don't believe that the way you achieve this is through quotas. So, so for me, the idea of extending this extremely flawed system that ends up deepening cleavages in society, deepening a sense of separateness among various groups, is obviously anathema. So the idea that you should be doing this equally in the private sector is obviously something I'm not on board with. And I agree entirely with Gurcharan Das that there is already a crisis of quality. You already have firms that struggle to get the kind of people they want, and even there in this sort of relatively narrow space where people are allowed to make decisions rationally. If you start then adding on by political mandate all kinds of reservations, it really will be a huge crisis for the Indian economy.
Okay, Professor Srivastava, I want to get down to the basics of how this is really going to work. And you're right in saying that, state legislatures will have to pass this, at least 50% of them, for this to really become a constitutional amendment. But let's presume for a minute that this will eventually be a reality, because the political class is very united on not opposing this. They are questioning the government, they're talking about jumlas, they are criticizing timing, but on the political front of it, they don't want to be seen on the other side of this bill, on the wrong side of it actually. But I'm just curious to understand, how difficult will it be to identify economically backward class based on incomes? How much of a misuse could this lead to? There are no upper caste certificates like there are for other reservation categories. How is this really going to work then? And what sort of a misuse are we really staring at?
Indeed. Yeah. Look, yes. Look, I think that, in the Indian context, that's a very common occurrence, since within this the rule that is being proposed, reservation that's being proposed, there are certain there's income criterion. There are criteria that relate to ownership of land, ownership of accommodation, housing, for example, and that in India is not very difficult to manufacture and to produce. There's an entire economy that runs on fake documents, etc., etc. That is one part of the problem. The other part of the problem, I think we have to also realize that it also opens up an entire, if you like, kind of a Pandora's box, in the sense you will have other groups who are genuinely, for example, a group that is perhaps genuinely more disadvantaged. Muslims, for example, will have a legitimate claim on asking for reservations. You may have OBCs who will, again, legitimately perhaps ask why aren't there reservations that equal to their proportion of the total population. So the number of factors which I think will become distractions from what any government should actually be doing, which is focusing on how to create more employment, how to create better skilled people. Our skills development program largely is in a terrible state because we haven't focused upon it properly, because we don't have good enough trainers. Those are things we should be focusing on in order to create a level playing field. I don't actually agree with this idea that there's automatically some kind of equality of opportunity in as asymmetrical a society as we do. We can only create a level playing field by the government or all political parties taking the difficult decisions that they do need to take. The current measure of this 10% reservations is something that's going to be a massive distraction, because it really opens up. There's no simple way of actually determining who these people are going to be. And then there will be other groups who will also, quite legitimately in many ways, ask for quotas for themselves, such as OBCs and Muslims, for example. So these are some of the actual problems, everyday problems that any policy such as this is going to face.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No denying that. And I think, in fact, we've had people on the show already from the OBC community, and they believe that, there should be a 42% quota, and I don't think we can run away from that reality. But I do want to ask one more question, and Mr. Habibullah, the question has to be about the criteria that has been fixed. 8 lakh per annum, or 1,000 square feet of house, or 5 acres of land. Aren't these way too generous in a country as poor as ours? I mean, you go to the hinterland, you go to rural parts of UP and Bihar and, Hindi heartland, 5 acres is not a bad amount of land to hold. 8 lakhs per annum covers 95% of India's population. So is this a majoritarian move? Is this perhaps way too, I would say, way too generous? The criteria at least?
Well, you see, now you brought me back to my core question in the first place. I had welcomed the idea in concept. In terms of practicality, there are a large number of difficulties that arise that others have also noticed. Other members of your panel, Mr. Srivastava particularly, have pointed out the practical difficulties in trying to do this. As you're saying, does it mean 95% of the population? In which case you are killing the whole competitive attitude within our society. It would be something that everything is then consigned to quotas, and then if you're left out, so it's a question of how many people are going to be excluded. It's not a question of being inclusive, it becomes a question of being exclusive, that a certain section of the people will then be excluded from competing. These are difficulties. That is why I said the practical steps have to be examined very closely. That is not there naturally at present because this is only the outer bill. How it is going to be implemented, the question has been raised, what is going to happen in the states where the majority of the population reside? The union territories governed by the central government are only a small portion, and the central services. The second question, of course, is the question that has been raised there already. Are there enough jobs? So it will be again a question of a concept. But who is going to benefit? And is it going to benefit the community? We already know that just a few jobs, even if there are a large number of jobs, it will benefit a few families. Will it eliminate poverty? It will not. It will not be an instrument of actually eliminating poverty. It will mitigate poverty for a certain section of the people. I mean, even if you're recruiting a million people every year, it is only 1 million families who are going to be benefited. And you're not going to be able to recruit all that many people in the government. So the question really is wide open. So whereas I would say that yes, the idea is a good idea of moving out of the caste straitjacket and moving into the question of economic deprivation. But how it's going to work has to be worked out very carefully. And this is, other initiatives have been mentioned, demonetization.
Right.
Many of them have not worked
Right.
properly because the details were not worked out properly. Let us hope that in this case, the details will be worked out and we are able to understand what those are before they actually go for implementation.
Right. I will have to go with my last line of questioning, and if I may begin with Professor Srivastava and go around the table. And Professor Srivastava, the only silver lining perhaps in this entire exercise is that it's going to take the stigma of reservations. I know there are WhatsApp jokes about it and things like that, that will you now desist to go to somebody who's come in from the 10% quota because people refrain from going to people who came from the other quota. Is that perhaps the only stigma? It takes the stigma of reservations and the recruitment that happened through that route.
Well, it's a very inefficient way of removing stigma. It's a very messy way of removing stigma, and it's a completely it's not a way in which any policy should be formulated. What we need to be focusing on is, in fact, why is it that there is this stigma for a group of people who have been historically so subject to discrimination. And secondly, I think the other fundamental thing we should be focusing on is why is it that people are so deeply attracted to government jobs? I mean, why is it that the perks that the government servants get are so excessive that the large numbers of people think that the best job that is out there for them is in the government. In fact, in many of the skills development programs that the government runs in the villages in our country, most people think that they're actually going to get a government job. And large numbers of people quit training when they realize that these are not government jobs that they're being set up for. These are the fundamental questions we need to be thinking about. Why what are the attitudes that lead to this this extraordinary stigma that people suffer when they shouldn't be, and these exaggerated perks that government servants get that lead large numbers of people to think that doing an entrepreneurial job or a private business is much worse off, because in many senses it is, because the kind of the perks of office and the powers of office that government servants have. And I think these are fundamental questions we need to be focusing on.
I think those are important questions that you raised that we should focus on. But Sadanand, I'm going to put the tricky political one to you. Everybody has called it a jumla. People have questioned the timing. But then all political leaders have come on record, have held press conferences and said they are going to support the move in parliament because nobody wants to be seen on the wrong side. So at the end of the day, the cynical caste equations, the social re-engineering clauses, that's what drives our political class, and there is no looking away from it.
I mean, I personally am not entirely convinced that this is some kind of, political masterstroke. If you happen to belong to one of the so-called upper castes, your life has really not changed dramatically at all. Even if you're in that 10%, you're competing with 95%. And if you're among the Dalits and the OBCs, I think the idea that India could be moving away from caste-based to income-based reservation, which I agree with Mr. Habibullah would be a great thing if it were happening. I don't think it's happening, but it will, in any case, it could potentially, stoke certain fears. So I know that this is sort of awkward for politicians to oppose openly, but I really don't see, at least at this point, how this is some kind of great political masterstroke for the BJP.
Oh yeah, a very quick two last questions, and Mr. Habibullah, I'll take one to you. And while it's good to see, like you said, the economic criteria being put, if at all reservations have to happen to move away from caste. But is that what is really happening? I mean, what is really happening is perhaps yet another caste equation that is now being put into use. And the question that I really want to ask you is, do you believe this is going to further fuel fear in the minds of OBCs or SC/STs who have for long feared that amendments are being made to reservations, that reservations are being tampered with, and which is perhaps why we will see new voices of greater quota for them?
Well, you see, so far as SC and ST are concerned, they've had these apprehensions for a long time. You do know that there has been a report, and I speak from my experience as the chairman of the Minorities Commission, that there was a report that the people among the SCs, it includes Sikhs, it includes Buddhists, it does not include Christians and Muslims, many of whom, or most of the Christians in fact, are people who were converted from being SCs and so on, because it's been argued that the scheduled caste and discrimination has nothing to do with religion, and therefore they also merit it. But it was strongly opposed by the Scheduled Caste Commission with the support of the community, because for a long time it had been felt that the reservations, which were exclusively at one time for the SC and ST, are being watered down. So now you have an expansion there. So there will be a watering down. Your question about the political advantages that are to be taken, you see, the opposition, as you say, would support the bill, but when it becomes difficult to implement it, the question that I raised is going to be a major challenge. If the government is able to overcome that challenge of implementation, well, I wish it well. The question is that it's going to again take time, and when it takes time, the opposition is going to go for the jugular, because they will say that they have promised this and they're not able to do it. So these are various issues that are going to come up, and therefore there is going to be rivalry, there is likely to be resentment. These are issues. I mean, these are not impregnable issues that the government has to avoid under any circumstances. The government must take these into account in charting its course towards this kind of reservation.
Oh yeah, absolutely, no denying that. A quick last word to Gurcharan Das, and then I close this. Mr. Das, I know you were very excited and you really did think that there will be a lot of free market thinking and push for business under the Modi government. At least in 2014, a lot of us thought so. How disappointed are you that the government, in a very desperate sort of an attempt, has resorted to a move like this at the end of its tenure? I mean, there is a reason why they say the best time for the worst decisions is the last 3-6 months in the government, and they haven't disappointed.
Yeah. Well, great political ideas do not make great economic ideas. And you're absolutely right that I was someone who supported Mr. Modi because I bought his rhetoric in 2014. And while he has done some good things, I feel very disappointed by this action, because this goes fundamentally against creating a competitive economy. And India's share of exports, of global exports, is only 1.7%. Even if it could go up to 2.5%, if it went up to there, we would get a demographic dividend. There would be jobs would be created, and he would have got easily re-elected in 2019. And so it is a focus on the economy, on the jobs that is important. Now let me also say one thing before, that there is a value in the American idea of affirmative action. And the value there is that diversity is good. You should have people from all segments of society. But diversity does not mean that you compromise your standards. It doesn't. Americans' courts have always been against quotas, and that's what we have in India. And so I think while we should try, you are absolutely right, the private sector should work hard to bring diversity into the companies, but it should not be via quotas.
I think moving away from really the political rhetoric and talking about how it's going to be implemented, how much time this is going to take, is this just going to be a political gimmick ahead of elections? Why is there such a fascination? An interesting point that was raised in this debate about, government sector jobs. Is private sector going to be burdened with this as well? Many questions that India will continue to find answers to. The bottom line is, have we failed our people in creating jobs? Have we failed our people in imparting the right education, that we've got to resort to measures like this? On that note, completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. Can't thank this wonderful panel enough. Wajahat Habibullah, Sanjay Srivastav, Sadanand Dhume, and of course Gurucharan Das for joining us on this edition. There's plenty more that continues right here on ET Now. Keep it with the channel that brings you news and views that matter.